Me and one of my good friends, I'll call him Jesse, would go on camping trips once or twice a year. We used to more when we were roommates in college, but we both work full-time now. Jesse was the one who actually got me into camping, having done it his whole life. I hadn't even been camping once before I met him. This happened 2 years ago, on one of our yearly camping trips that we went on in the summer. To specify, we didn't go far out or anything. We basically went down a trail, maybe 2 hours out, then set up our tents and everything. The whole point of it was to camp, not to hike, and usually for around 4 to 5 days. When we got to a good spot, Jesse and I put everything together and relaxed. The next 3 days were just as you'd expect. We sat at the campfire and had some drinks and just talked. We went for some walks and played some board games as well, but to sum it all up, we really just relaxed. I mean, that was the whole point of it anyway. On the 4th day, we agreed to wrap it up and head back the next morning. As the sun was starting to set, we prepared to get the campfire going again. Jesse said he'd go for a short walk and collect some dry sticks, and he asked me to get the food out and prep it for cooking. I did as he said, but as the sun faded out, Jesse still wasn't back. It had been maybe 30 minutes, which wasn't a long time for a walk, but it was a long time to be collecting sticks. I figured he must have meant he was going for a walk just to walk, and not necessarily for the sticks. I waited another 30 minutes. The sun was now fully set, and it was getting really dark. I had turned on our heavy lamp for a light source, but I knew it would run out of batteries if I left it on too long. I was getting really worried about Jesse. He was the one who was experienced in everything, so it just didn't make sense for him to get lost like this. I figured it best to at least start the fire so that if he was lost, maybe he'd see the flame and find his way back. I took the lamp and collected a bundle of sticks and started the fire with some matches. By the 2-hour mark, I was really losing it. I didn't know what to do. I was trying to decide between looking for him or going back and calling for help, or just staying put. Every scenario was running through my head. What if he'd gotten hurt and wasn't far away? Then looking for him would make sense. But if he was far away, then me getting lost would only burden everything more. 2 hours and 30 minutes after I'd last seen Jesse, and 2 hours after nightfall, I heard a gunshot. It was far off, somewhat in the direction Jesse went in, but what really scared me about it was that neither of us had brought a gun. I stood up and paced around the campsite for a minute before grabbing the lamp and going out to try and find him. It didn't take long before I heard steady footsteps running toward me. My hand was trembling, holding up the lamp, but the light only reached a few feet ahead. I saw a figure getting closer, and I barely recognized them to be Jesse. His eyes were wide open, and he looked horrified. I'd never seen anyone's expression be that visibly scared before. He told me in a sharp, hushed voice that we needed to leave right now. We ran back to the camp and got our backpacks, but left the rest behind. I questioned him, but he refused to answer until we made it out of the woods. He said someone else was there and approached him on his walk. They held him at gunpoint, making him be quiet and follow them somewhere. Before they reached wherever it was they were taking him, Jesse tried for his escape, and that's when I found him running. That's all he told me, and ever has told me every time I ask. I can tell he's purposefully leaving out some important details, but he still refuses to share them. one he specifically leaves out is the gunshot. He never mentioned it. Personally, I know Jesse is a capable guy, and it wouldn't be far off to assume he tried to overpower the man holding him up. Maybe he got the gun away from him and did what he had to do to escape. It would explain Jesse's traumatized state and why the man didn't chase him. I don't know what happened back there, but ever since, Jesse hasn't wanted to go camping again. Honestly, neither do I, but I just wish I could know the truth about what went down that night.
I'm not sure if I should tell this story, but I've held it in for years. But because it sounds crazy, I was told not to talk about it. I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite we picked was beautiful, and we were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that were not far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere. Absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car, went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, came back and had dinner. It was all very normal, until we woke up the next day. First, I need to give some context as to how we slept that night, so you can understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler and stereo into the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent, away from the door. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest the door of the tent, with a gun next to him. When we awoke next morning, I felt fine. I'd slept hard, and from inside the tent, everything seemed normal. When we got out, though, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces lying next to a tree. All the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt off now. It was quiet and not the beautiful campsite that I saw yesterday. Everything about those woods felt wrong now. My ex accused me of not locking the car the night before, and then an animal got into our stuff. I promised that I had locked it and went into the tent to grab the keys from my backpack, but they weren't there. Eventually, I found them later on the ground next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what just happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home and told me that he had a dream the night before about something kneeling over him in the tent, holding his gun, and just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again and said that he didn't want to talk about it and that I shouldn't talk about it anymore either. I've tried to forget about it, but I can't. Something wrong happened to us in the woods that night.
I'm 29 and I live along the Appalachian Range in lower West Virginia. I've been going backpacking and camping for years, exploring different trails all around the nearby mountains. My best friend, who lived just a few miles from me, would often join me on these hikes. We usually planned one big trail every year in the fall, being anywhere from a few days to a whole week of backpacking and camping. In 2019, we planned to take a trail across the range to a small lake at the top of the mountains. In the days leading up to the trip, though, my friend had to call it off because of an emergency at his work. I'd already taken the whole week off of work and had everything ready to go, so I decided to just go alone. On Monday morning, I drove to a nearby trailhead, then started my route. This wasn't a regular recreational trail like you'd typically see on a 4-hour hike. These backpacking trails didn't have defined paths, so you have to use maps, compasses, and landmarks to navigate where you're going. Typically, there's a large landmark in the distance, like a specific rock formation that you hike toward, and when you get there, you can see your next landmark, and so on. I spent the first 2 days hiking toward a ridge in the mountains. When it got dark on the second day, I set up camp several hours from reaching the ridge. I pitched the tent and got a fire going, then heated up some of the food I brought in my bag. The sun had already set, and it was around 8 o'clock when I laid in my tent to rest and read. I left the fire going, planning to put it out before actually sleeping. 20 minutes into reading, and through the fire crackling outside, I heard the strong sound of a stick snapping right behind my tent. I jolted up. My first thought was a black bear, possibly having smelled the food I cooked earlier. I didn't hear anything else though. I crawled out of the tent and shined a flashlight into the tree line behind my tent. Nothing. I called out aggressively to scare away any predators, but again, there were no sounds of anything running away. It was really strange because the stick snapping was very distinct, definitely being from something stepping on it. I stayed outside the tent for a while, looking around constantly before putting out the fire and going inside. I found it really hard to sleep that night because I was so focused on listening for more sounds. In the morning, I was almost surprised to have even slept through the night. I packed my tent and everything else at the campsite, then continued along until I reached the ridge. From there, it was a straight shot to the lake. I was moving fast, trying to get there before dark so I wouldn't have to move my campsite again the next day. I arrived with about an hour to spare before sunset. The lake was beautiful, very much worth the hike. I walked around it, enjoying the scenery, then pitched the tent and set up my camp on the tree line beside the lake. As I sat by the fire, I kept turning around, hearing soft noises somewhere between the trees behind me. I figured I was just being paranoid, but it was really creepy. It almost sounded exactly like footsteps, but I knew nobody would be out here. I would have seen their tent when I walked around the lake. It was too dark at this point to see anything further than a few feet, so looking around wasn't an option anymore. An hour later, I got in my tent and laid down. Every few minutes, I would hear footsteps again. They were barely too quiet for me to tell for sure what they were though. Eventually, I got so tired that I fell asleep. Then, what I think was only an hour after I fell asleep, I woke up to the sound of someone running away from my tent. I jolted up and grabbed my flashlight, rushing out of the tent and looking in the direction of the footsteps. I saw the bare back of them running away in the distance. My heart was beating rapidly. I looked down and saw footprints all around my tent like they had been walking around me and searching the campsite. I tried to get the campfire going again as fast as I could so I could see better. I was terrified. I had nowhere to go and nobody to help me. I sat at the fire all night, keeping my head on a swivel, but I never saw or heard anything else. In the morning, I snapped a few pictures of the lake, then started the hike back. I had planned to stay for a whole day. I wasn't comfortable anymore, feeling like I was being followed. I was able to make it back without any more trouble, thankfully. But, along my journey, I began noticing several things missing from my backpack. Small things, like food, a few tools, etc., but I always had my bag with me. Even today, I wonder if whoever had been outside my tent that one night had actually snuck inside and stole from my bag while I was asleep. Even the thought of it makes my whole body shiver